Hey Grace Church, my name is Jesse. Welcome to the weekly for the week of July 23rd. Today we're talking about the stoning of Stephen. So the story of Stephen covers a lot of verses. It goes from chapter 6 all the way through 7 and ends in chapter 8. It is 78 verses, and one of the big picture things is it's a transition from Jerusalem. So far, everything's been happening in Jerusalem to after this, through the persecution, the church spreads into Judea and Samaria. And so the story is a transition story in the larger book of Acts. But Stephen, as a person, is identified as having 5 things: faith, the Holy Spirit, grace, power, and wisdom. And he's full of these things. And so this is an incredible man. And in the story, he begins to debate with some Jews from this certain synagogue. Now, he is winning the debates and they don't like it. And so they go from debating and losing to kind of like a smear campaign. They start talking to other people and convincing them that they're going to take him on trial, arrest him by force, and accuse him of heresy, which is what happens. And so he is before the Sanhedrin, and they ask him, "Is this true? Have you been saying heretical things about God and Moses?" And he responds with this long sermon. And I'm going to summarize it with basically 4 different movements within the story of Israel. The first one is the story of Abraham, who is this infertile, him and his wife, migrant. He was asked by God to leave his family and his land and his wealth and just go trust God. And so it's the story of Abraham and how the nation began through Abraham and Sarah. And then the second part is Joseph in Egypt, and how really the nation of Israel grew and became a nation in a foreign land. And it was Joseph's brothers who sold him into slavery. That's some family dysfunction right there. And how Joseph was in this kind of this non-Jewish context where he had favor by God, and he's not in the place where the nation of Israel would finally end up. And then the third is Moses and the liberation from the bondage of Egypt that the Jewish nation 400 years later had grown into, and how the people of Israel rejected Moses as a leader at first, and along the way, and they rejected God by creating idols and worshiping other idols. And how the tabernacle was formed, and how God's presence was kind of mobile in this tabernacle as they're wandering through the desert. So that's the third movement. And the final one is David and Solomon, who create the monarchy, the kingships, but also the temple, the kind of the place, the more permanent place where God's presence would dwell. So Stephen tells this entire story about the nation of Israel to try and communicate certain points about God. And it's this, that God is a God that will change things and innovate as the people of God are following him in the journey. And it is God's initiation. It's his providence. It's not the people that are doing it. It is God that's doing it. And so 3 points that we drew from this story. Number 1 is that God is going to call his people into new and often challenging moments. It was challenging for the nation of Israel, and it will be challenging to us as God invites us into new things. And how do we respond with faith? So that was the first point. The second point is that your heart of worship to God is more important than the place of worship. And we often get this backwards. We say, "Oh, I go to this church," and our identity often is in the church that we attend. And that is less important than our heart of worship in whatever place we are with God in San Diego or around the world. And then the third point is that hypocrisy angers the heart of God. As they're accusing Stephen of disobeying God and abolishing the law, Stephen is saying, actually, it's you guys who are doing it, not me, and that you guys are pretending to represent God and pretending to sit on the throne and the judgment seat in the Sanhedrin representing God and his law, but actually you guys are the ones that are breaking the law, and that's hypocrisy, and it's pretending to be something that you're not. And we see all throughout the Gospels and in this moment as well that it angers God's heart when the people of God are being fake and not actually following God. And so in response to Stephen's accusations, in response back to them, they literally cover their ears, they run at him, they grab him, and they take him out of Jerusalem, and they stone him to death. And Stephen is a godly man, a righteous man, a man that's like doing great things for God, and he ends up experiencing evil and destruction, and awful things happen to him. And so we talk about theodicy, which is the study of why evil and suffering happens. And he's a martyr. He's the first martyr. And we talked about like the different martyrs throughout history, through the voice of the martyrs, and this book called Jesus Freaks, where it highlights different stories of martyrs. But really, how it applies to us more specifically is all of us experience suffering and evil, and how do we respond? Theodicy is how do we respond to the evil and the suffering and the injustice of this world? And so there was 4 practices that we identified. The first one is lament. Lament is this question of, God, why me? Why is this happening to me? And that we can respond and lament with rage all the way to silence, and any of those emotions or feelings coming up, God can handle those things. And eventually that lament turns into rituals of writing out our laments and our griefs to God and our mourning, or expressing those laments through stories. And in that's a way of delivering and restoring us. So that's the first practice. The second one is forgiveness in the face of evil. And it's this idea that all people, even the perpetrator of evil, is a human being and not a monster, and that we need to humanize everyone and see everyone as broken, and even ourselves as capable of doing awful things. And that forgiveness is a way that causes that rage to come out of us and to be removed from our hearts. And the third practice is a practice of thoughtfulness, specifically thoughtfulness for those who are suffering, intentional practices of caring for those who are hurting and suffering and grieving, and how can we be intentional to be thoughtful for those people in our lives. And the fourth one is hospitality for the vulnerable. For those people who are experiencing suffering or pain, they can feel like an outsider. They can feel like they don't belong because of the tragedy that they're experiencing, and how can we bring them into our presence and be hospitable and invite them into our home and our place of friendship and belonging. And so the end of the passage is that Stephen sees the Son of Man, Jesus, standing for him, and he forgives. He says 2 prayers: God, forgive those who are doing this to me, which is incredible. And second, God, receive my spirit. He says, Jesus, receive my spirit. And Jesus stands for him and welcomes him into the kingdom of heaven. So there's 2 things that I'd like for you to discuss. Number 1 is Stephen's sermon, and how do we take away the certain points that Stephen wants us to understand, and then even see our lives like Stephen as he comes to the end of his life, and what does that mean for us? And then the second thing is theodicy, and would love for you to discuss how is it that we as Christians understand evil and suffering, and how do we respond to it in this world. Enjoy your discussion.